It was already past working hours when the office began to empty, one quiet goodbye after another fading into the polished corridors. The usual hum of keyboards and distant conversations had softened into silence, leaving behind only the faint buzz of overhead lights and the city glowing through the glass walls. I was packing up when her voice stopped me. "Stay a moment." Simple. Calm. The same composed tone she always used in meetings. And yet something about it felt different. I nodded, setting my bag back down, trying not to overthink it. She walked ahead of me into her office, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor, steady, measured, confident. I followed, closing the door behind me out of habit. But then I heard it. A soft click. Not mine. I turned slightly. She had locked it. It shouldn't have meant anything. There were a dozen reasonable explanations: privacy, an important discussion, sensitive work. And yet, the sound echoed in my chest in a way I couldn't explain. The air shifted. Her office always felt imposing, floor-to-ceiling windows, a wide desk that seemed to draw a line between her world and everyone else's. But tonight, it felt smaller. Warmer. Too quiet. She didn't sit right away. Instead, she stood near the edge of her desk, flipping through a file with slow, deliberate movements. I noticed things I had never paid attention to before: the slight pause of her fingers on each page, the way she exhaled quietly as if something weighed on her mind. "Come here," she said, not looking up. I stepped closer, stopping just beside her desk. She angled the document slightly toward me, explaining something about a contract, her voice low and controlled. I tried to focus, I really did, but my awareness kept drifting. Her perfume was subtle, something soft and warm, not overpowering. It lingered in the space between us. When she leaned slightly closer to point out a line on the page, her sleeve brushed against my wrist. A small touch. Accidental. But neither of us moved right away. It lasted barely a second, maybe less. Still, something about it felt noticed. I cleared my throat quietly, shifting my weight, trying to ground myself back in the moment. "This clause, it could cause issues later," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. She finally looked at me then. Not the usual sharp, assessing look she gave in meetings. This was slower. Thoughtful. Almost as if she was seeing me, not just as an employee, but as something more human, more present. Her gaze lingered a fraction longer than it should have. And for the first time, I didn't know what she was thinking. The silence stretched, not awkward, but unfamiliar. Charged in a way that didn't belong in a workplace. Outside, the city lights flickered in the distance. Inside, it felt like time had slowed. She straightened slightly, closing the file, but she didn't step away. If anything, the space between us felt intentional now. I realized then, it wasn't just the locked door. It was everything that came with it. The quiet. The closeness. The unspoken shift in the way she looked at me. Something had changed. And I wasn't sure either of us knew how to name it yet. She closed the file with a soft, deliberate motion, her fingers resting on top of it for a moment longer than necessary. The conversation about contracts faded, almost naturally, as if either of us had the energy, or the intention, to return to it. For a few seconds she said nothing. Then she exhaled. It wasn't loud, not dramatic, but it carried something with it, something tired. "You know," she began quietly, her voice losing that polished edge she carried in meetings. "People think this level of success makes everything easier." I didn't interrupt. It didn't feel like something meant to be interrupted. She stepped away from the desk, moving toward the window. The city lights reflected faintly against the glass, outlining her silhouette. For the first time, she didn't look like the commanding figure everyone else saw. She looked human. "Decisions never stop," she continued, her gaze fixed outside. "Every choice affects someone. Every mistake costs more than it should." She paused, her fingers lightly brushing against her arm as if grounding herself. "And there's no one you can really talk to about it. Not honestly." There it was. Not weakness, but honesty. Raw, unfiltered in a way I hadn't expected from her. I shifted slightly, unsure whether I should respond or simply listen. "That sounds exhausting," I said finally, keeping my voice gentle. She gave a faint, almost amused smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "It is." Silence followed again, but this time it felt different. Not heavy, just open. She turned back toward me, slower than before. Her expression had softened, the sharpness replaced with something quieter. More vulnerable. "I don't usually say things like this," she admitted, almost under her breath. "I figured," I replied, offering a small, understanding smile. That seemed to ease something in her. Just slightly. She moved back toward the desk, but instead of standing behind it, behind that invisible barrier she always maintained, she leaned against its edge, closer to where I stood. The distance between us changed again. Not by much. But enough. "I've built everything by staying in control," she said, her voice steady but softer now. "That's how I've survived this world." Her hand lifted briefly, brushing a loose strand of hair back behind her ear. The gesture was simple, but there was a faint tremor in it, something I wouldn't have noticed before. "But sometimes," she hesitated. It was the first time I'd ever seen her hesitate. "Sometimes it feels like there's nothing left of me outside of that." The words lingered in the space between us. I felt something shift inside me, not attraction, not yet, but understanding. A quiet recognition of the weight she carried behind the image everyone else respected, or feared. "You don't seem like someone who's lost herself," I said carefully. Her eyes met mine again. This time, the look was different. Not assessing. Not distant. Searching. "And how would you know that?" she asked softly. I didn't have a perfect answer. No clever line, no professional response. So I told the truth. "Because you wouldn't be saying this, if there wasn't still something real underneath it." For a moment, she didn't react. Then, slowly, something in her expression changed. Not a smile, not fully. But something warmer. Quieter. Like a wall had cracked, just enough to let someone see through. And for the first time since I'd known her, it felt like she had let me stand on the other side of it. The room grew quieter after that, though nothing around us had actually changed. The city still glowed beyond the glass. The lights still hummed softly overhead. But something between us had shifted, settling into a silence that didn't feel empty, just full of things neither of us had said yet. She didn't move right away. Neither did I. For a moment, it felt like we were both adjusting to this new version of the same space, one where the distance between boss and employee had quietly blurred into something far less defined. Her gaze lingered on me again. Not in the sharp, analytical way I was used to during meetings or presentations. This was slower. Thoughtful. As if she was seeing me piece by piece, noticing details she had overlooked before. It made me suddenly aware of everything, how I was standing, where my hands rested, the rhythm of my breathing. I swallowed lightly, trying to ground myself. "Is there anything else you wanted me to review?" I asked, though even to my own ears, the question sounded more like an attempt to break the moment than a real concern. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she took a small step closer. Not abrupt. Not forceful. Intentional. "No," she said finally, her voice quieter than before. "Not really." The words hung there, simple but loaded in a way I couldn't fully explain. She was close enough now that I could see the subtle details in her expression, the faint lines at the corners of her eyes, not from age but from years of holding herself together. The softness in her gaze that hadn't been there before. The way her composure wasn't gone, just loosened. It made her feel more real. More present. My chest tightened slightly, not out of discomfort, but awareness. She reached out then. Slowly. Her hand hovered for a brief second, as if giving me time to step back, to close the distance she was about to cross. I didn't move. Her fingers wrapped gently around my forearm, not gripping tightly, not claiming anything, just holding. Steady. Grounding. The contact was simple. But it wasn't casual. It sent a quiet warmth through me, the kind that made everything else fade just a little into the background. Either of us spoke. We didn't need to. Her thumb shifted slightly, not quite a stroke, not quite still. It felt more like a question than a gesture. Are you okay with this? I let out a slow breath I hadn't realized I was holding. And I stayed exactly where I was. That was my answer. Her eyes lifted to meet mine again, searching, careful, almost cautious despite everything about her that suggested confidence. For the first time, I realized something important. She wasn't used to this either. Not this kind of closeness. Not this kind of uncertainty. It wasn't power driving this moment. It was something far more fragile. Something unguarded. The realization softened something in me. I didn't pull away. But I didn't move closer either. I just let the moment exist. Her hand remained on my arm, warm and steady, as the silence between us deepened, not tense, not awkward, but charged with something neither of us was ready to name. Outside, the world carried on like nothing had changed. Inside that office, everything had. The moment held, quiet, steady, and impossibly fragile. Her hand was still resting on my arm, warm and grounding, but now I could feel something else beneath it, hesitation. Not uncertainty in me. In her. That realization shifted everything. Up until now, I had always seen her as someone who moved through the world with absolute certainty, every step calculated, every word intentional. But here, in the stillness of her office, that certainty felt thinner. Human. And suddenly, the weight of what was happening settled in. This wasn't just a moment. It was a line. One we had both reached without meaning to. My chest tightened slightly as reality crept back in. The office, the locked door, the fact that in every other version of this world, this would never happen. She was my boss. A woman people respected, feared, answered to. And me? I took a slow step back. Not abrupt. Not rejecting. Just enough to create space. Her hand slipped from my arm, lingering for the briefest second before falling back to her side. I saw it then, the flicker in her expression. Not hurt, but awareness. She noticed. Of course she did. For a moment neither of us spoke. The space between us wasn't large, but it felt different now. Defined. Real. I should probably. I started, my voice quieter than I intended, but I didn't finish the sentence. I wasn't even sure what I was trying to say. Leave? Reset? Pretend none of this had happened? None of it felt right. Her gaze didn't leave mine. But it softened. Not the sharp, commanding presence she wore so effortlessly in front of others. This was something else entirely, gentler, more careful. I understand, she said. 2 simple words. But they carried more than they should have. She didn't step forward this time. Didn't try to close the distance again. Instead, she leaned back slightly against the edge of her desk, as if giving the moment room to breathe. I didn't plan this, she added after a pause, her voice low, almost thoughtful. Whatever this is. There was no embarrassment in her tone. No apology. Just honesty. I let out a slow breath, running a hand lightly through my hair as I tried to steady my thoughts. Yeah, I figured. A faint smile touched her lips, not amused, not teasing. Just real. For someone who's built her entire life on control. She continued, glancing briefly toward the window before looking back at me. This is a little unfamiliar. There it was again. That vulnerability she didn't show anyone else. It made it harder to walk away. Harder to reduce this moment to something simple or dismiss it as a mistake. It's not just you, I admitted quietly. I don't really know what to do with it either. The words felt heavier once they were out. But they were true. Something unspoken passed between us then, not agreement, not resolution, but recognition. We both felt it. That pull. That quiet, undeniable shift in the way we saw each other now. And the risk that came with it. She straightened slightly, her composure returning, but not fully. Not like before. There was still a softness in the way she held herself, a trace of the woman she had allowed me to see. "We don't have to figure it out right now," she said gently. It wasn't avoidance. It was restraint. A choice. I nodded, understanding more than the words themselves. The line was still there. Clearer now than before. And neither of us crossed it. But neither of us stepped too far away from it either. We just stood there, on opposite sides, close enough to feel it, and aware that everything between us had already begun to change. The space between us remained, measured, careful, but it no longer felt like a barrier. It felt like something we were both aware of, and choosing not to hide from. For a few seconds neither of us spoke. The quiet had changed again. It wasn't tense, not uncertain in the same way as before. It felt softer now, like the edge of something fragile that neither of us wanted to disturb too quickly. She rested her hands lightly against the desk behind her, her fingers curling against the polished surface as if anchoring herself there. Her gaze drifted for a moment, not away from me completely, but not directly at me either. Thinking. Processing. Maybe even deciding. I took a slow breath, realizing that if either of us said something now, the moment might slip into silence again, unresolved, unfinished. "You don't have to carry all of it alone." The words came out quieter than I expected, but steady. Her eyes lifted immediately, meeting mine. There was no confusion in her expression. No need to ask what I meant. She understood. Of course she did. For a second, she didn't respond. But I saw it, the shift in her posture, the way her shoulders dropped just slightly, as if something inside her had finally loosened. It wasn't dramatic. It was subtle. Real. "That's not really how my world works," she said softly, though her voice lacked the firmness it once had. "Maybe not," I replied, taking a small step closer without fully closing the distance. "But that doesn't mean it has to stay that way." The words hung between us, not as a challenge, but as an offering. Something simple. Something human. She looked at me then in a way she hadn't before, not searching, not questioning. Just seeing. Really seeing. And for the first time, it felt like she wasn't measuring the situation, wasn't calculating outcomes or consequences. She was just there. With me. Her breath left her slowly, almost like a quiet release she hadn't allowed herself in a long time. And then it happened. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. She shifted her weight forward, just slightly, as if her body had made the decision before her mind fully caught up. The distance between us narrowed, not enough to feel overwhelming, just enough to feel present. Real. I didn't move away. I didn't rush forward either. I simply stayed. My hand lifted without much thought, hovering for a brief moment near her arm, the same place she had touched me earlier. This time, the hesitation was mine. But she didn't pull back. That was all I needed. My fingers rested lightly against her elbow, gentle, careful, as if giving her every chance to step away if she wanted to. She didn't. The contact was soft, barely there, but it carried more meaning than anything we had said so far. I felt the slight tension in her arm at first, then the gradual easing of it, like she was allowing herself to accept the gesture instead of resisting it. Her head dipped just slightly, her gaze lowering for a moment, not in discomfort, but in something quieter. Relief. That was what it was. She wasn't leaning into me. But she wasn't holding herself as rigidly either. It felt like something inside her had finally given itself permission to rest, even if just for a moment. Either of us spoke. There was no need. The silence wrapped around us again, but this time it felt warm. Steady. Safe. And in that quiet, subtle way, the distance between us didn't disappear all at once. It simply stopped mattering. The silence between us deepened, but it no longer felt like something fragile. It felt inevitable. Her arm was still beneath my hand, the contact light but steady. I could feel the warmth of her through the fabric, the subtle rise and fall of her breath. She hadn't moved away, but she hadn't moved closer either. We were suspended somewhere in between. And somehow, that felt more intense than anything else. She lifted her gaze again slowly, as if the weight of the moment made even small movements deliberate. Her eyes met mine, and this time there was no hesitation in them, only awareness. Of me. Of herself. Of everything that stood quietly between us. My hand shifted slightly, not tightening, not pulling, just adjusting enough to acknowledge the moment. Her fingers responded in kind, brushing faintly against the back of my hand. Not quite holding. But not letting go. It was the smallest movement. And yet it sent a quiet tension through the air, like a thread being pulled tighter, inch by inch. Her lips parted as if she might say something, but no words came. Instead, she exhaled softly, her breath warm in the small space between us. We were closer now. I wasn't sure when it had happened. Or who had closed the distance. Maybe either of us had consciously done it. Maybe we had both just stopped resisting it. The room seemed to fade again, the desk, the windows, the world outside. All that remained was the quiet rhythm of two people standing far closer than they ever should have been. Her hand shifted again, this time more intentionally. Her fingers slid against mine, not fully intertwining, but enough to feel the shape of my hand against hers. A question. A possibility. I felt it in the way she looked at me, not demanding, not expecting. Just asking. For a moment, everything inside me stilled. Every thought about boundaries, consequences, perception, they were still there, but quieter now. Distant. What replaced them wasn't impulse. It was awareness. Of her. Of the woman standing in front of me, no longer hidden behind authority or control. Just present. Real. Allowing herself to be seen in a way that felt rare, maybe even unfamiliar to her. I could see it, the slight tension in her shoulders, the careful way she held her breath, as if unsure whether the moment would move forward or slip away. She wasn't in control of this. Not entirely. And that mattered. My thumb moved slightly, brushing against her fingers, gentle, almost hesitant. Not a claim. Not a decision. Just an answer. I see you. Her eyes softened instantly, something unspoken passing through them, relief, maybe. Or recognition. We were so close now that it would have been easy to close the distance completely. Too easy. And that was exactly why we didn't. The moment stretched, not breaking, not rushing, just existing in that delicate space where everything felt possible, and nothing had been decided yet. Her gaze dropped briefly to my hand, then returned to my eyes. There was something there. Not fear. Not doubt. Choice. And in that quiet exchange, we both understood the same thing. Some moments aren't about what you do. They're about what you choose to hold back. And somehow, that made it even more powerful. The moment didn't break. It softened. That was the first thing I noticed. Not a sudden shift, not a sharp realization, just a quiet easing, like the air between us had exhaled on its own. Her fingers, still resting lightly against mine, began to relax. Not pulling away abruptly, just loosening, as if she had reached the end of something unspoken. I felt it instantly. And I didn't try to hold on. Slowly, gently, she let her hand slip from mine. The warmth lingered for a second longer, fading in a way that felt more meaningful than the touch itself. She stepped back, not far, just enough to create space again. But this time, the distance didn't feel like a wall. It felt like something chosen. Intentional. Her posture straightened slightly, the familiar composure returning, but it wasn't the same as before. It wasn't cold or distant. There was still a softness in the way she held herself, a quiet openness that hadn't been there when I first walked into the room. She turned toward the door. For a brief moment, her hand rested on the lock. The same lock that had changed everything. There was a pause, not long, but noticeable. As if she understood the weight of what that small action meant now. Then she unlocked it. The soft click echoed again, but this time, it didn't tighten the air. It released it. She didn't open the door right away. Instead, she turned back to me. For a second, either of us spoke. The space between us was clearer now, grounded again in reality, but something had shifted underneath it. Something neither of us could undo, even if we tried. "Thank you," she said quietly. It caught me off guard, not because of the words, but because of how she said them. Not formal. Not distant. Real. I frowned slightly, not in confusion but in quiet curiosity. "For what?" Her gaze held mine, steady but softer than I had ever seen it. "For staying," she replied after a small pause. "Not just tonight." The meaning settled slowly. She wasn't talking about work. She was talking about everything that had just happened, everything I had seen. Everything she had allowed me to see. I nodded, understanding more than I could easily put into words. "You don't have to do everything alone," I said again, more quietly this time. Something in her expression shifted at that. Not surprise. Not resistance. Just acceptance. A faint smile touched her lips, small, almost unnoticeable if you weren't paying attention. But it was there. And it felt real. "I'll try to remember that," she said. It wasn't a promise. But it wasn't dismissal either. It was enough. She stepped aside then, giving me space to walk toward the door. As I passed her, there was a brief moment, just a second, where our shoulders nearly brushed. Neither of us moved away too quickly. Not lingering. Just aware. I reached for the handle, pausing for the slightest moment before opening it. I glanced back once, not because I had to, but because something in me needed to. She was still standing there, watching. Not as a boss. Not as someone distant or untouchable. Just her. And for the first time, it felt like I understood what that meant. I gave a small nod, something simple, but full of everything I couldn't say out loud. Then I stepped out. The door closed quietly behind me, and the world outside felt the same as it always had, busy, indifferent, unchanged. But I wasn't. And I knew, either was she. Whatever had started in that room didn't need to be defined yet. It was enough that it existed. And that we had both chosen not to rush it.